I learned 3 important lessons during my 20-year career in law enforcement. Never assume anything. Always verify the facts. And HOA board members can be more dangerous than armed suspects when they think they have power. The third lesson hit me hardest on a freezing January morning in Anchorage, Alaska, when my neighbor decided to weaponize the police department against me, not realizing I was the one who signed their paychecks. The whole mess started at 5:30 in the morning when I fired up my Polaris Snowmachine in my driveway. I had been police chief of Anchorage for 3 years, and before anyone asks, yes, I still took regular patrol shifts because sitting behind a desk all day would drive me insane. That particular morning, I was heading out early to check on road conditions in the hillside neighborhoods where we had received reports of black ice causing accidents. My department vehicle, a Ford Explorer, was equipped for winter driving, but nothing beats a snow machine for accessing some of the more remote residential areas during an Alaskan winter. I had lived in the Eagle Ridge subdivision for 5 years, moving in long before the HOA got established. The neighborhood sat in the foothills with stunning views of the Chugach Mountains, and back when I bought my house, it was a quiet community where people minded their own business. Then about 18 months ago, a group of newcomers decided we needed an HOA to maintain property values and establish community standards. I voted against it, along with about 40% of the residents, but we got outvoted. The HOA started innocuously enough with guidelines about trash, can placement, and lawn maintenance schedules. Then the rules started multiplying like rabbits. No parking RVs in driveways. No sheds visible from the street. No exterior paint colors without approval. No Christmas decorations before December 1st or after January 10th. The list went on and on, each new rule more absurd than the last. My snow machine sat in my garage most of the time, but I pulled it out whenever I needed it for work or weekend rides. It made some noise when starting up, sure, but this was Alaska. Snow machines, four-wheelers, and loud trucks were part of the culture. If you wanted peace and quiet, you moved to a senior living facility, not a neighborhood where half the residents were outdoorsmen. I let the machine warm up for about 3 minutes, which was standard procedure in negative 10-degree weather, then headed out. The sun would not rise for another few hours, so I had my headlights on as I navigated through the neighborhood streets toward the main road. The snow machine handled beautifully, and I was mentally planning my patrol route when my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled over and checked the screen. It was my secretary, Linda, from the station. At 5:45 in the morning, that meant something urgent. "Chief, we have got a situation," Linda said when I answered. "Dispatch just received a noise complaint from your neighborhood. The caller is demanding immediate police response for a disturbing the peace violation." I felt my jaw clench. "Let me guess. Eagle Ridge, you got it." The caller identified herself as Patricia Morrison, HOA president. She said, and I quote, "Some inconsiderate criminal is operating illegal racing equipment in a residential zone and waking up the entire neighborhood. She wants the perpetrator cited and the vehicle impounded." I actually laughed. Patricia Morrison had been a thorn in my side since she moved to Alaska from California 2 years ago. She had appointed herself HOA president within months of the association forming and treated the position like she was governing a small nation. Every community meeting turned into her personal stage where she lectured everyone about property values and community standards. "Linda, tell dispatch I will handle it personally. I am already in the area." "Chief, you want me to tell them you are the noise complaint?" "Not yet. Let us see how this plays itself out." I pocketed my phone and continued my patrol, checking the hillside roads for ice and noting several areas that needed salt treatment. I radioed the information to the morning shift supervisor and finished my rounds around 7. By then, daylight was starting to break over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. When I returned home around 7:30, I found a neon orange citation stuck to my garage door. It was not a police citation, but an HOA violation notice printed on cardstock with official-looking borders. The notice informed me that I had violated HOA Bylaw Section 12, Paragraph 4, which prohibited the operation of recreational vehicles before 8 in the morning on weekdays. The fine was $250, due within 10 days. I read the notice 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. Recreational vehicle. My Snowmachine was department equipment that I used for official police business, and when exactly had this bylaw been passed? I attended the HOA meetings when I could, but my schedule did not always allow it, and I never received notice of any such rule. I went inside, changed into civilian clothes, and pulled up the HOA website on my laptop. Sure enough, buried in a document updated just 3 weeks ago, Section 12, Paragraph 4 prohibited snow machines, 4-wheelers, motorcycles, and other loud recreational vehicles from operating in the neighborhood between 10 at night and 8 in the morning on weekdays, or before 9 on weekends. The rule had been passed at a special meeting I had missed because I was testifying in a homicide trial. No individual notice had been sent to residents, just a generic email blast I apparently overlooked in my overflowing inbox. I could have paid the fine and moved on, but something about the situation rubbed me wrong. Patricia Morrison had called the police on me, wasting department resources, without even knowing who I was or why I was using the snow machine. She assumed I was some reckless troublemaker and demanded I be punished. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, scheduled for that Thursday evening, and address the situation properly. Thursday arrived with fresh snowfall and temperatures hovering around 0. The HOA meetings took place in the Eagle Ridge Clubhouse, a fancy facility that our HOA fees helped maintain. I arrived at 7, still wearing my police uniform since I came directly from work. The clubhouse parking lot was half full, which was typical. Most residents avoided these meetings because they inevitably devolved into Patricia and her 2 board members, Susan and Margaret, lecturing everyone about various violations while the treasurer, an elderly man named George, sat silently reviewing financial reports. I walked into the main room where folding chairs faced a long table at the front. Patricia sat in the center seat, with Susan and Margaret flanking her like lieutenants. George occupied the end position, hunched over a spreadsheet. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA president. She was in her late 40s with an angular face, blonde hair cut in a severe bob, and the kind of pursed lips that suggested she had spent years perfecting her disapproving expression. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a turtleneck, and reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She glanced up when I entered, and I saw the flicker of recognition cross her face. Everyone in Anchorage knew who the police chief was, between news conferences and community events. Her expression shifted from surprise to calculation. "Chief Irving," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "What an unexpected pleasure. Are you here in an official capacity?" "No, Patricia. I am here as a resident addressing an HOA matter." I took a seat in the front row, directly in front of her table. About 15 other residents were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking bored or resigned. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. She went through the standard agenda items: reading minutes from the last meeting, reviewing the financial report George had prepared, and discussing upcoming community events. Then she reached the violations and fines section. "We have several outstanding violations to address," Patricia said, putting on her reading glasses and consulting a printed list. "First, number 42 Mountain View Drive has not repainted their mailbox post as required. Second notice. Fine increased to $300. A man in the back row groaned but said nothing. Number 17 Ridgeline Court has an unauthorized storage container visible from the street. This is completely unacceptable and brings down property values for the entire neighborhood. Fine of $500. "That is my tool shed," a woman called out. "It is behind my house. It can be seen from the street if one walks to the corner, which makes it a violation. You need to move it or construct privacy screening." The woman looked furious but did not argue further. I was beginning to understand why so many residents looked defeated. Patricia continued through her list, issuing fines and second notices for various infractions. Finally, she reached my case, and we have a serious violation at number 8 Summit Place. The resident operated a loud recreational vehicle at 5:30 in the morning, disturbing the peace and violating our clearly stated community standards. I personally called the police to report this criminal activity. I stood up. "That would be me, Patricia. And I would like to address this violation." The room got very quiet. Patricia's face tightened, but she maintained her composure. "Chief Irving, the rules apply to everyone equally. Just because of your position does not exempt you from community standards." "I agree completely," I said. "However, I have several issues with this citation. First, I never received individual notice of this new bylaw. Second, I was operating department equipment in the course of official police business, not a recreational vehicle. Third, you wasted police resources by calling in a false report when you could have simply spoken to me directly." "The email notification was sent to all residents," Patricia said sharply. "We are not responsible if you fail to read your email, and I saw no police markings on that machine. Because it is an unmarked unit used for undercover and plainclothes operations. And a mass email is not adequate notice for a significant rule change that carries substantial fines. Most HOAs are required to provide 30 days written notice for major bylaw amendments." Patricia's face flushed. "This is Alaska, Chief Irving. Snow machines are extremely loud and disruptive. We have elderly residents and young families who need their sleep. Your inconsiderate behavior set a terrible example." "You know what else is inconsiderate?" I kept my voice level and professional. "Calling 911 to report a noise complaint when you could have knocked on my door. Do you have any idea how many actual emergencies we handle every morning? Domestic violence calls, car accidents, medical emergencies. Instead, my dispatcher had to field your complaint about someone starting their snow machine." "I called the non-emergency line," Patricia said defensively, "which still requires dispatcher time and resources to log, route, and track. You weaponized the police department against a neighbor instead of acting like an adult and having a conversation." Susan, one of the board members, leaned forward. "Chief, we understand your position, but rules exist for a reason. If we make exceptions for you, everyone will want exceptions." "I am not asking for an exception. I am asking for common sense. My job requires me to respond at odd hours and use various equipment. I do not blast music at 3 in the morning or host loud parties. I started a snow machine in my own driveway to perform my duties as police chief, checking road conditions after reports of dangerous ice that caused 3 accidents that morning. The bylaw makes no exceptions for occupation," Patricia said firmly. If you need to use that vehicle for work, you should keep it at the police station, not in a residential neighborhood. I felt my temper flare but kept it in check. So your solution is that I should drive to the station, get the Snowmachine, then drive back to my own neighborhood to patrol it. Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? I realize that your convenience does not trump the peace and comfort of 30 families. Show me one other complaint, just one. Did anyone else call to report the noise? Patricia hesitated. I received verbal complaints from several concerned neighbors. Names. I do not have to provide that information, because they do not exist. You were the only one bothered, Patricia. You looked out your window, saw something you did not like, and decided to exercise your power. The room was dead silent now. Several residents watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed glee. Patricia Morrison was not popular, and watching someone stand up to her was apparently entertaining. Margaret, the other board member, cleared her throat. Chief Irving, we appreciate your service to the community, but the HOA board voted unanimously to implement these quiet hours. The vote was legitimate and binding. How many people attended that meeting? I asked. George, the treasurer, spoke up for the first time. 14, including the board. Out of 93 homes. That is less than 16% of the community making rules that affect everyone. And you are telling me this is democratic? Patricia slapped her hand on the table. This is not a debate, Chief Irving. The rule stands and you owe $250. You can pay tonight or we will add late fees. I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery. Before we proceed, I want to show everyone something. I held up my phone, displaying a screenshot I had taken from the HOA website. This is the current version of the bylaws, showing Section 12, Paragraph 4. I also pulled up the archived version from 6 months ago using a web cache. I swiped to another screenshot. Notice anything interesting? I walked to the front table and showed Patricia directly. The old version had quiet hours from 10 at night to 7 in the morning. The new version changed it to 8 without any substantial notice to residents who might be affected. According to Alaska state law regarding HOAs, any bylaw amendment that substantially affects resident rights requires 30 days written notice and a formal vote at a regular meeting with proper quorum. Patricia's face went pale. We followed proper procedure. Did you? Because I checked the meeting minutes. The bylaw change was listed as a minor amendment under new business, not a major agenda item requiring a vote. No quorum requirement was met because you classified it as administrative. Susan and Margaret exchanged worried glances. George suddenly looked very interested in his spreadsheet. Furthermore, I continued, I checked the Alaska Homeowners Association Act. HOAs are required to provide notice of rules that could result in fines or liens against property. A mass email buried in routine correspondence does not meet that standard. The proper procedure is individual written notice via certified mail or hand delivery. This is absurd, Patricia sputtered. You are trying to bully this board with legal technicalities. No, I am pointing out that you are not following the law, which is ironic, considering you called the police on me for what you thought was illegal activity. A man in the third row started clapping slowly. Others joined in. Patricia looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. I was not finished. I checked something else too. When did you move to Alaska, Patricia? I fail to see how that is relevant. Humor me. 2 years ago. From California, correct. And Susan, you moved here from Oregon 18 months ago. Margaret from Washington State 2 years ago. All 3 women stared at me with varying degrees of hostility. Here is what I find interesting, I said. The three of you moved to Alaska from the West Coast and immediately started implementing rules that are completely contrary to Alaskan culture. Snow machines are not recreational toys here. They are essential equipment. People use them to access remote cabins, to hunt, to work, to survive. Trying to ban their use in a residential neighborhood is like trying to ban pickup trucks in Texas. We are not banning them, Patricia said through gritted teeth. We are setting reasonable hours. 5:30 in the morning is a reasonable hour. People go to work. They check trap lines. They head out for hunting. This is Alaska, not a suburban neighborhood in Sacramento. Patricia stood up abruptly. This meeting is getting off track. Chief Irving, your fine stands. If you refuse to pay, we will place a lien on your property as outlined in the HOA covenant. Go ahead and try. I will see you in court, and I will bring every resident you have harassed with your made-up rules and excessive fines. We can let a judge decide if this HOA is operating legally. I turned to address the other residents. Anyone else here dealing with unreasonable fines or rules they never received proper notice about? Hands shot up around the room. More than half the attendees raised their hands. The woman who had been cited for the tool shed spoke up. They fined me $500 for a shed that is completely hidden from the street unless you trespass on my neighbor's property to see it. Another man said, they threatened to fine me for parking my work truck in my driveway because it has a company logo on the side. I am a plumber. How am I supposed to get to work? A younger woman added, they sent me a violation notice because my Christmas wreath had the wrong color ribbon. Apparently only red and green are allowed, and mine had silver. The complaints kept coming. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but the room had turned against her. Residents were standing up, shouting about unfair fines and ridiculous rules. George, the treasurer, quietly packed up his things and slipped out a side door. Susan and Margaret looked shell-shocked. This was clearly not what they signed up for when they joined the board. I let the chaos continue for a few minutes, then held up my hand. The room gradually quieted down. Here is what I suggest, I said. The board should suspend all pending fines until a proper legal review of the bylaws can be conducted. Any rules implemented in the last 18 months should be put to a formal vote at a properly noticed meeting with legitimate quorum requirements. And maybe, just maybe, the board should consider that not everyone wants to live in a neighborhood with 75 pages of regulations. You cannot dictate board policy, Patricia said, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. I am not dictating anything. I am making a suggestion as a concerned resident. You can take it or leave it. But I promise you, if you continue down this path, you will face legal challenges that will cost this HOA a fortune in attorney fees. And I will be happy to recommend several residents who have been unfairly fined to file a class action lawsuit. I picked up my citation from the table where Patricia had been keeping it as evidence. I tore it in half and dropped it in the trash can by the door. Meeting adjourned, I said, and walked out. The next morning, I received an email from George, the HOA treasurer. He had resigned from the board effective immediately. Attached to his email was a detailed financial report showing that Patricia had been spending HOA funds on personal expenses, including a $600 dinner at a fancy restaurant she claimed was a board meeting, flowers for her house that she classified as common area landscaping, and over $3,000 in office supplies that were never delivered to the clubhouse. George wrote that he had been keeping quiet because Patricia intimidated him, but watching me stand up to her had given him courage. He was turning over all financial records to the HOA membership and recommended a full audit. I forwarded the email to the entire HOA mailing list, with a note suggesting an emergency meeting to discuss board recall procedures. That afternoon, Patricia showed up at the police station. She walked past the front desk, ignoring Linda's protests, and barged into my office. "You have no right to interfere with HOA business," she said, slamming the door behind her. I looked up from my computer. "Patricia, you need to leave my office right now. You do not have an appointment and I am working. You slandered me by forwarding that email." George had no authority to share confidential financial information. George was the treasurer, which means he had every right and responsibility to share financial information with HOA members. And I did not slander you. I forwarded factual information. Those expenses were legitimate. Then you should have no problem explaining them at an emergency meeting. I believe it is scheduled for tomorrow night. Patricia's face went from red to purple. "You think you are so smart, don't you? Coming in with your legal arguments and your badge. You are nothing but a bully." I stood up and walked around my desk. "Let me be very clear about something, Patricia. I did not start this fight. You called the police on me for doing my job. You issued an illegal fine based on a bylaw that was not properly implemented. You have been harassing residents for months with arbitrary rules and excessive penalties. All I did was shine a light on your behavior. I am protecting property values. No, you are on a power trip. There is a difference." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "You have 5 seconds to leave my office before I have you escorted out for trespassing." Patricia's hands clenched into fists, but she turned and stormed out, nearly knocking over Linda in the hallway. The emergency HOA meeting the next night drew 72 residents, the largest turnout in the subdivision's history. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row, content to watch events unfold. Patricia, Susan, and Margaret sat at their usual table, but the mood was completely different from the previous meeting. The residents were organized now. A retired attorney named Donald had agreed to moderate the meeting, and he immediately took control from Patricia. "This meeting has been called to address serious concerns about HOA governance and finances," Donald said. "We will begin with a presentation of the financial irregularities discovered by George Mitchell, former treasurer." George nervously walked to the front and used a projector to display spreadsheets showing questionable expenses. The evidence was damning. Patricia had spent over $15,000 in HOA funds over the past year, with many expenses having nothing to do with community needs. Residents shouted questions and accusations. Patricia tried to defend herself, claiming everything was board-related, but her explanations were weak and contradictory. Then Susan shocked everyone by standing up and saying, "I did not know about any of this." Patricia handled all the finances herself. She told us the treasurer's report was just a formality. Margaret nodded vigorously. "I only joined the board to help with the summer picnic. I had no idea Patricia was spending money like this." Patricia turned on them. "You both approved every expense." "We approved general budget categories," Susan shot back. "We did not approve you buying flowers for your personal garden." The meeting devolved into chaos again. Donald called for order and suggested a formal vote on 3 measures: immediate suspension of the current board, a complete audit of HOA finances by an independent accounting firm, and a recall election for all board positions. All 3 measures passed with over 90% approval. Patricia stood up and pointed directly at me. "This is all your fault. You orchestrated this witch hunt because you did not want to follow simple rules." I remained seated. "Patricia, I just wanted to start my Snowmachine in the morning. You turned it into World War III." 2 weeks later, the independent audit came back. The accountant found $23,000 in improper expenses over 18 months. Some expenses were potentially defensible as poor judgment, but others constituted clear fraud. Patricia had written HOA checks to herself for services she never provided and reimbursed herself for personal purchases. I had to make a professional decision. The audit evidence was handed to me through proper channels, and as police chief, I had an obligation to investigate potential crimes. I recused myself from the case due to personal involvement and handed it to my deputy chief. The investigation confirmed that Patricia had committed multiple counts of theft and fraud. The district attorney filed charges, and Patricia was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning. Local news covered the story, and it became a minor sensation. HOA president arrested for embezzling from her own neighborhood. Susan and Margaret cooperated with the investigation and were not charged. They both admitted they should have paid more attention but were not involved in the actual theft. The trial happened 4 months later. I had to testify about the timeline of events, starting with the Snowmachine complaint and ending with the financial discoveries. The prosecutor built a solid case showing deliberate theft of funds Patricia was entrusted to manage. The jury found her guilty on 8 counts of theft and 3 counts of fraud. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, plus full restitution of the stolen funds and community service after release. As part of her sentencing, the judge made a statement I will never forget. You were given a position of trust within your community, and you abused that trust for personal gain. You weaponized rules and regulations not to help your neighborhood, but to create an environment where you held unchecked power. This court hopes your sentence serves as a reminder that no position, no matter how small, is immune from accountability. After Patricia's arrest, the HOA went through a complete restructuring. The new board, elected by legitimate vote with actual quorum, immediately repealed about 80% of the rules Patricia had implemented. The quiet hours for snow machines and other equipment were adjusted to 10 at night through 6 in the morning, which was reasonable and matched most local noise ordinances. Fines that Patricia had issued were reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Most were refunded or waived. The tool shed woman got her $500 back. The guy with the work truck had his violation dismissed. My $250 fine was formally voided, though it had never been paid. The new treasurer, a certified accountant named Rachel, implemented proper financial controls with mandatory quarterly reports to all residents. Every expense over $100 required board approval with documented receipts, and the board positions rotated annually to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. People still followed reasonable guidelines about property maintenance and common courtesy, but the atmosphere of fear and harassment disappeared. Residents started actually talking to each other again, instead of worrying about getting reported for minor violations. I continued my routine of occasional early morning snow machine rides when work required it, and nobody ever complained again. In fact, several neighbors told me they found the sound comforting, a reminder that law enforcement was actively monitoring the area. One Saturday morning about 6 months after the trial, I was in my garage working on my snow machine when my next-door neighbor, Frank, walked over with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing me a cup. Frank was in his 60s, retired from the oil industry, and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. He had been around before the HOA existed and had voted against it like I had. "Thanks," I said, taking the coffee gratefully. "You know, "I never thanked you properly for what you did," Frank said. Standing up to Patricia like that, most of us were too scared or too tired to fight back. "I just got tired of the nonsense, and she made the mistake of calling the cops on the police chief." Frank laughed. "Best mistake she ever made from our perspective. I was about ready to sell my house and move rather than deal with her rules. My wife and I talked about it seriously. That bad. Chief, she fined us $400 because our garage door was open too often. Said it was an eyesore. We were doing renovations and needed access to tools. She did not care. Said we should have applied for a renovation permit from the HOA and kept the door closed between work periods." I shook my head. "That is insane. You are telling me." "But you stood up to her, and that gave the rest of us permission to do the same. So thank you." We stood there drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular for a while. It was nice, the kind of neighborly interaction that should be normal in any community. Susan, Patricia's former board member, ended up moving back to Oregon about a year after the trial. She told people she was embarrassed by the whole situation and wanted a fresh start. Margaret stayed but kept a very low profile, focusing on actual community service like organizing food drives and neighborhood cleanup days. George, the treasurer who blew the whistle, became something of a local hero. He was invited to speak at other HOA meetings around Anchorage about the importance of financial transparency and standing up to board corruption. He always started his talks by saying, "I was too scared to act until I saw someone else being brave first." The Eagles Ridge HOA still exists, but it operates on a completely different philosophy now. Rules are minimal and reasonable, focused on genuine health and safety issues rather than arbitrary aesthetic preferences. Meetings are brief and businesslike, usually lasting under an hour. Most importantly, residents are not afraid of their own HOA anymore. I learned a lot from the experience about the danger of unchecked authority, even in small doses. Patricia was not a criminal mastermind or a terrible person when she started. She was just someone who got a little bit of power and let it corrupt her judgment. She convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood when really she was just satisfying her need for control. The Snowmachine incident became a running joke at the police station. Whenever someone complained about a difficult call or frustrating interaction, someone would inevitably say, "At least they did not try to fine you for doing your job." It usually got a laugh. My deputy chief, a sharp woman named Lieutenant Harris, pulled me aside one day and said, "You know, Chief, that whole situation could have gone very differently. You could have abused your position, threatened Patricia with your authority, made her life hell. But you handled it by the book, used the system properly, and let justice take its course. That is good leadership." "I just did not want to pay an illegal fine," I joked. "Bullshit. You saw an opportunity to help a lot of people being harassed by a petty tyrant and you took it. Own that." She was right, even if I had not fully articulated it to myself at the time. The HOA situation was not really about me or my snow machine. It was about a community being held hostage by someone who confused authority with service. The incident also affected how I ran the police department. I became much more conscious of how rules and policies could be weaponized, even unintentionally. I started reviewing our own department procedures to make sure we were not creating unnecessary burdens on the public or giving officers too much discretionary power in minor situations. I implemented a new policy requiring supervisory review of any non-emergency call involving neighbor disputes. Too often, police get pulled into personal conflicts that should be resolved through conversation, not citation. Patricia calling the cops on my snow machine was a perfect example of misusing emergency services, because someone lacked basic conflict resolution skills. We also started a community mediation program, partnering with local volunteer mediators to help resolve neighborhood disputes before they escalated. The program was hugely successful, reducing our call volume for noise complaints, property disputes, and HOA-related conflicts by nearly 40% in the first year. One unexpected outcome of the whole mess was that I became something of an accidental advocate for HOA reform. Other residents from different neighborhoods started reaching out, asking for advice on dealing with overreaching boards or questionable rules. I was not a lawyer and could not give legal advice, but I could point people to resources and encourage them to stand up for their rights. The local news did a follow-up story a year after Patricia's conviction, examining HOA issues across Anchorage. I agreed to an interview where I discussed the balance between community standards and individual freedom. The segment struck a chord, and the City Council ended up passing new regulations requiring more transparency and accountability for HOAs operating within city limits. Patricia served 14 months before being paroled. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved back to California and was living with her sister. Part of her parole conditions included not serving on any HOA board or similar organization for 5 years. I hope she used that time to reflect on what went wrong and how her behavior affected dozens of families. I never spoke to her again after her arrest. There was nothing to say. She made her choices and I made mine. The justice system did its job and everyone moved on. My Snowmachine still sits in my garage, ready for early morning patrol runs or weekend adventures in the backcountry. Every time I start it up, I think about that January morning and how a simple noise complaint spiraled into exposing corruption and reforming an entire community organization. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just paid the fine and stayed quiet. Patricia would have continued her petty tyranny, stealing from the HOA and harassing residents with impunity. Eventually, someone else might have challenged her, or maybe everyone would have just accepted it as the price of living in the neighborhood. But that is not who I am. I became a cop because I believe in fairness and justice, in protecting people who cannot protect themselves, and in standing up to bullies regardless of their title or position. Whether the bully is a violent criminal on the street or an HOA president with a badge lanyard and a fining pad, the principle is the same. Alaska is a unique place with a unique culture. We value independence, self-reliance, and the freedom to live our lives without excessive interference. Those values sometimes conflict with the increasing suburbanization and regulation creeping north from the lower 48. The challenge is finding the right balance between community cooperation and individual liberty. HOAs can serve a valuable purpose when they focus on genuine shared interests like maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and handling issues that affect everyone. But when they become vehicles for petty tyrants to impose their personal preferences on everyone else, they do more harm than good. The Eagle Ridge situation taught me that sometimes the most important battles are not against major crimes or dangerous criminals, but against the small injustices that chip away at community trust and personal dignity. Fighting back against an illegal $250 fine might seem petty, but it represented something larger: the right to live in your own home without fear of arbitrary punishment. Years later, I still run into former Eagle Ridge residents around Anchorage. They always thank me for standing up to Patricia and the board. Some of them credit that experience with teaching them to question authority and demand accountability, lessons they have applied in other areas of their lives. Frank, my neighbor who brought me coffee that morning, became one of my closest friends. We go snowmachining together on weekends, riding up into the mountains and exploring remote valleys. He always jokes that he wants to start his machine extra early just to see if anyone will complain, though of course nobody does anymore. The new HOA board asked me to serve as president about 2 years after Patricia's conviction. I politely declined. I explained that my job kept me too busy, and besides, I thought they were doing fine on their own. The truth was I had no interest in running an HOA. I just wanted to live in peace and do my job without someone trying to find me for breathing wrong. The whole experience reinforced something I had learned over 20 years in law enforcement. Most people just want to be left alone to live their lives. They want reasonable rules that make sense, fair treatment from those in authority, and the opportunity to be heard when they have legitimate concerns. They do not want power-hungry bureaucrats, whether in government or HOAs, making their lives miserable over trivial nonsense. Patricia Morrison taught me that lesson more clearly than any criminal I ever arrested. She showed me how ordinary people can become corrupted by even the smallest amount of authority, and how important it is to have systems in place to check that corruption before it causes real damage. She also taught me that sometimes justice requires standing up and fighting back, even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on. Because it is never really just about you. There are always others being hurt by the same abuse, and they are watching to see if anyone will be brave enough to challenge it. I was not trying to be a hero that January morning when I started my snow machine. I was just trying to do my job. But when Patricia decided to weaponize the police department and the HOA against me, she picked the wrong person to bully. I had the knowledge, resources, and position to fight back effectively, and I chose to use them not just for myself, but for every resident being harassed by her arbitrary rules. Would I do it again? Absolutely. In fact, I would probably do it sooner and more aggressively, knowing what I learned about Patricia's financial crimes. But I am grateful things played out the way they did, because it demonstrated that the system can work when good people stand up and demand accountability. The Eagle Ridge HOA is now a model for how these organizations should operate. Minimal rules, maximum transparency, and leaders who understand they are servants of the community, not rulers of a fiefdom. Property values are actually higher than they were under Patricia's regime, proving that reasonable governance is better for everyone than authoritarian control. I still serve as police chief of Anchorage, and I still live in the same house on Summit Place. My snow machine still wakes me up on cold winter mornings when duty calls, and I still get a small thrill every time I start it up, remembering the absurd chain of events that machine triggered. Life in Alaska is not always easy, but it is honest. We face real challenges here: brutal weather, geographic isolation, economic volatility. Those real challenges put things in perspective and make it clear how absurd it is to waste energy fighting about snow machine noise or tool shed placement. Patricia learned that lesson the hard way, sitting in a cell because she could not tell the difference between legitimate authority and personal power trips. I hope she learned something from the experience, though I will never know for sure. What I do know is that Eagle Ridge is a better place now, and dozens of families can live in their homes without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. That is worth far more than avoiding a few uncomfortable confrontations. Sometimes I drive through other subdivisions around Anchorage and see the signs: HOA enforced or community standards apply. I wonder how many of those neighborhoods are dealing with their own Patricia Morrisons, petty tyrants making life miserable for residents who just want to live in peace. I hope my story spreads and encourages others to stand up when they face similar situations. Not everyone has the legal knowledge or professional position to fight back effectively, but everyone has the right to demand fair treatment and accountable governance. The battle between individual freedom and community regulation will never be fully resolved. It is a tension that exists in every society, at every level of government and private organization. But that tension can be healthy when it is balanced by transparency, fairness, and respect for human dignity. Patricia Morrison forgot those principles, and it cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and ultimately her place in the community she claimed to be protecting. That is a steep price to pay for refusing to let someone start their snow machine at 5:30 in the morning. As for me, I learned to appreciate what I have: a good job serving a community I love, a comfortable home in a beautiful neighborhood, and neighbors who actually act like neighbors instead of enforcement agents. I learned that sometimes the biggest battles come from the smallest conflicts, and that standing up for what is right is always worth it, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. And I learned that snow machines are not just transportation or recreation in Alaska. They are symbols of the freedom and independence that define our state's character. When someone tried to take that away over an arbitrary rule, they learned that Alaskans do not give up their freedoms without a fight. The whole saga took nearly 2 years from that first cold January morning to Patricia's final sentencing. In that time, I saw the best and worst of human nature: the petty tyranny of someone drunk on power, but also the courage of people like George who risked retaliation to expose wrongdoing, and the resilience of a community that came together to demand better governance. I am proud of how it all turned out, proud that I did not back down or take the easy path, and proud that my small act of defiance sparked larger changes that benefited everyone. Sometimes being a leader means standing alone against opposition. Other times it means standing up first so others feel safe following. That January morning, when I started my snow machine in the dark Alaska dawn, I had no idea I was setting off a chain of events that would expose corruption, reform an HOA, and teach me valuable lessons about authority and accountability. I was just trying to go to work and do my job. But that is how the most important moments often happen in life. You are just going about your business, doing what seems right, and suddenly you find yourself in the middle of something bigger than you expected. The question is whether you rise to the challenge or back down from it. I chose to rise, and I have never regretted that choice. The Eagle Ridge subdivision is better for it. My police department learned from it, and I grew as both a leader and a person because of it. And somewhere in California, Patricia Morrison hopefully learned that power without accountability is not power at all. It is just abuse waiting to be exposed, and eventually, someone will always be willing to expose it. She just had the bad luck that the someone in her case was the police chief she tried to have arrested for doing his job. That is the real lesson of this story. Be careful who you try to bully, because you never know who they really are or what they are capable of when pushed. And more importantly, be the kind of person who stands up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable or risky. Because someone has to go first, and it might as well be you. I went first that night at the HOA meeting, and 72 residents followed me to the next one. Together, we took back our neighborhood from someone who forgot that leadership is service, not dominion. And we did it using the tools of democracy and justice, proving that systems work when good people engage with them. Now, when I fire up my snow machine on a cold Alaska morning, the sound does not just mean I am heading to work. It is a reminder that freedom requires vigilance, that authority must be checked, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for your community is refuse to accept injustice, no matter how small. Patricia called the police when my snow machine woke her up, not knowing I was the police chief. That mistake cost her everything. But more importantly, it freed an entire neighborhood from tyranny and reminded everyone involved why we have laws, rules, and accountability in the first place. Not bad for a 5:30 wake-up call on a January morning in Anchorage, Alaska.